Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to my channels. So we heard story about big farmers, right? Evil corporation prioritizing putting profit over people. But here's what nobody talk about. Where did this industry even come from? Like how we just go from a doctor mixing herb in the back of farmers to $1 million corporation that can negotiate directly with the governments. The answer is way more interesting than capitalism, but because it turns out Big Farmers wasn't created by greedy executives in the boardrooms. It was created by desperate parents in 1890s who were watching their children die from smallpox and by a government that realized it needed to do something first. What happened next accidentally built the entire business model that still runs healthcare today. And in this video, I'm going to show you how exactly it went down. Let's get into that. Picture this. It's 1,898 inches, Philadelphia. A pharmacist named Henry Mulford is running a modest drugstore when he makes a decision that seems completely insane. He hires a bacteriologist. Then he starts buying horses, lots of them. But here's the twist. He's not using these horses to deliver medicine. He's bleeding them on purpose for profit. And it works. Within just 7 years, Mulford's company explodes into one of the largest pharmaceutical manufacturers in America. Eventually, it merges into what we now call Merck, one of the biggest drug companies on the planet. So, what was his secret? Did he discover penicillin 50 years early? Invent some miracle cure? He did something far simpler and far more brilliant. He took a vaccine. People were already desperate to buy a vaccine for a disease that was killing one in every three people it infected. And he figured out how to make it at industrial scale. He didn't create demand. Terror did that for him. He just built the factory. And in doing so, he accidentally helped us the entire modern pharmaceutical industry. Here's the question. How did fear of one disease, smallpox, accidentally create the trillion-dollar big pharma machine we know today? To understand how we got here, we need to rewind to before the 1890s, back when making vaccines was less like running a pharmaceutical company and more like running a farm. Literally, vaccine production back then was what economists would call a cottage industry. Individual doctors would set up what they call vaccine farms. And these weren't metaphorical farms. They were actual stables with calves inside. Here's how it worked. A doctor would infect a calf with cowpox, a mild disease related to smallpox. Then, once pustules formed on the calf's skin, they'd harvest the lymph from those pustules, scrape it into little glass tubes, and sell it locally as smallpox vaccine. That was it. A stable, an operating room, maybe an assistant. These were small businesses run by physicians who saw growing demand and saw an opportunity to make some money on the side. And back then, there was only one vaccine in existence, smallpox. In fact, the word vaccine didn't mean what it means today. Throughout most of the 1800s, if someone said vaccine, they literally meant smallpox vaccine. There was no other kind. But here's the problem. There were zero rules, no quality control, no standardization, no government oversight whatsoever. If you had a cow and some basic medical knowledge, congratulations, you could enter the vaccine business tomorrow, which meant the product quality was all over the place. Some batches were potent, some were weak, some were contaminated with who knows what. And because these were fresh biological products, they couldn't travel far without spoiling. So if you lived in a rural area far from a vaccine farm, you might not have access at all. The system was fragile, unreliable, dangerous even, and it was about to break. Between 1870 and 1900, three massive forces collided at once. First, rapid urbanization. People were flooding into cities, cramming into tenements, living on top of each other. And in those conditions, diseases like smallpox spread like wildfire. Second, the science caught up. Advances in microbiology were finally proving germ theory, the idea that tiny organisms cause disease. Suddenly, vaccination wasn't just folk wisdom anymore. It was scientifically validated, which meant demand exploded. And third, smallpox itself kept coming back in waves, epidemic after epidemic, killing 1 in 3 people it infected. So you had dense populations of terrified people, scientific proof that vaccines worked, and a disease that wouldn't quit. Both individuals and state governments were now desperate for reliable vaccine supplies at a scale those little cottage farms could never hope to meet. And then came the disaster that changed everything. In 1901 and 1902, contaminated vaccine batches from poorly regulated farms killed several children. The public was outraged. The newspapers demanded action, and Congress responded. In 1902, they passed the Biologics Control Act, the first federal law to regulate vaccine production. Now, on the surface, this sounds like a simple safety regulation, right? Just clean up the industry, make sure products are safe. But here's where the economics get interesting. This crisis had created what economists call a demand-side market failure, combined with a regulatory vacuum. The market had massive demand, people desperately wanted vaccines, but consumers had no way to verify if a product was safe or deadly. They faced what's called asymmetric information. The seller knows the quality, but the buyer doesn't. And the stakes were literally life or death. So when Congress stepped in with the Biologics Control Act, they didn't just regulate the industry, they accidentally restructured it because now to legally sell vaccines across state lines, you needed federal licensing. And to get that license, you needed hygienic laboratories, large scale livestock operations, quality testing facilities, interstate distribution networks. In other words, you needed capital, serious capital. This transformed vaccines from a local medical service into an industrial product. And it created what economists love economies of scale. Companies that could afford the fixed cost of building modern facilities could now spread those costs across huge production volumes. They could win lucrative government contracts. They could dominate entire regions. The cottage industry was dead. The pharmaceutical industry was born. And companies like Park Davis and Mulford, the ones who moved fastest, were about to get very, very rich. So who won when the government accidentally created Big Pharma? The companies that moved fastest to industrialize, take Parker Davis, originally founded in Detroit in 1866. They started out making medicines from plants, what we'd call ethnobotanical drugs today. But in 1895, they saw the writing on the wall. They pivoted hard into biologics, starting with diphtheria antitoxin. Then in 1898, they added smallpox vaccine production. By moving early, they built in infrastructure, got the federal licenses, and secured the government contracts. Today, Parker Davis is part of Pfizer, or look at our friend Henry Mulford. In 1895, his company became reportedly the first private American company to produce diphtheria antitoxin. 3 years later, he's bleeding horses for smallpox vaccine, and he scaled fast, buying more livestock, building bigger labs, hiring bacteriologists. By the time the Biologics Control Act passed in 1902, Mulford wasn't scrambling to comply. He was already compliant. He'd built his moat before the law even existed. His company grew so large it was eventually acquired and merged into Merck, one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world today. By 1903, just 1 year after the federal law passed, only 13 licenses had been issued. 13 companies in the entire United States were legally allowed to manufacture vaccines for interstate commerce. And those 13 companies didn't just get access to private customers, they got government contracts. States needed vaccines for public health programs. The military needed them for soldiers. And now there were only a handful of licensed suppliers who could legally provide them. Federal licensing had created a moat around their businesses, expensive to enter, profitable to dominate. But for every winner, there's a loser. And the losers, they were almost completely wiped out. All those small scale vaccine farms and independent doctors who dominated the 19th century market gone. They couldn't afford to build hygienic laboratories. They couldn't maintain large livestock operations. They couldn't conduct the laboratory quality controls the new law required. And without federal licenses, they couldn't ship across state lines. The Biologics Control Act essentially regulated them out of existence. The standards weren't impossible, they were just expensive. Too expensive for a solo doctor with a few calves in a stable. One historical account described them as almost amateurish vaccine farms from the end of the 19th century. And within a few years of the regulation passing, they'd vanished. The industrial producers had achieved economies of scale the little guys could never match. It wasn't that the small farms made worse vaccines, though some certainly did. It's that they couldn't compete with companies that could produce 10,000 doses as cheaply as they could produce 100. The era of backyard vaccine production was over. The era of Big Pharma had begun. So here's what really happened. Smallpox didn't just create demand for vaccines. It created the entire business model for Big Pharma. Public terror generated guaranteed government demand. Federal regulation created barriers to entry that favored whoever had the most capital. And the first mass market for biological products established a template, high fixed cost, massive volume, government contracts that still defines the pharmaceutical industry today. It was never really about the science. It was about the economics. And here's the kicker. We just watched this exact same movie play out again. Sound familiar? COVID-19 followed the same script, beat for beat. Public fear created guaranteed government demand. Companies like Pfizer and Moderna received massive advance purchase commitments before their vaccines even existed. Smaller producers struggled to compete with industrial scale manufacturers who had the infrastructure already built. Remember Operation Warp Speed. In 2020, the US government pre purchased hundreds of millions of vaccine doses before they were even developed. Billions of dollars in guaranteed contracts. Those contracts are the direct descendants of the government smallpox contracts from 1902, the ones that birthed the pharmaceutical industry 118 years earlier. The economic logic hasn't changed one bit. When governments become the buyer of last resort during health crises, they don't just fund medicine. They build empires. Smallpox killed millions, but it also created an industry worth trillions. And the next pandemic, it'll probably do the same thing all over again. Because once you understand the pattern, you realize Big Pharma wasn't invented by scientists in labs. It was invented by terror in the streets and a government contract in the filing cabinet.